There's a particular moment a narcissist dreads more than almost anything else, more than an argument, more than a confrontation, more than being caught in an obvious lie. It's the moment they look at you and realize the person standing in front of them isn't breaking anymore, not performing calm, not holding it together by sheer will while quietly falling apart underneath. Genuinely structurally strong in a way that has nothing left in it for them to work with. This is your nightmare fuel to them, and today we're going to walk through exactly what happens next, what a narcissist actually does once they realize the strength they're facing is real, why their response follows such a predictable pattern, and why understanding that pattern in advance is going to protect you more than almost anything else you'll learn in this entire series. Let's start with why your strength specifically terrifies them, because it's not what most people assume. It isn't that strength makes you harder to control in some general abstract sense, though that's certainly part of it. It's something more specific and more threatening than that. Your strength is living proof that their version of events was never true. Remember, a narcissist's entire relationship with you was built on a story, usually one where you were framed, at least privately, as difficult, unstable, too sensitive, too much, or simply incapable of appreciating what they offered. That story needed something specific to remain credible, both to the people around them and to the narcissists themselves: your continued struggle. If you fell apart after the relationship ended, if you stayed anxious, reactive, easily provoked, the story held together. Your struggle was the evidence. Your strength destroys that evidence completely, and it does so in a way no argument ever could, because it isn't an argument. It's simply visible, undeniable reality. A person who was genuinely as unstable and difficult as the story claimed doesn't typically emerge from the relationship calmer, clearer, and more capable than before. If anything, the story predicts exactly the opposite outcome. When you show up steady instead, thinking clearly, setting firm boundaries, moving through your days without the chaos they were counting on, you're not just living your life. You're actively, silently disproving the narrative they need to survive believing about themselves. This is worth understanding at a deeper level, because it explains why a narcissist's reaction to genuine strength so often looks disproportionate to what's actually happening on the surface. From the outside, all you're doing is existing calmly, speaking clearly, holding a boundary without apologizing for it. From their side, what's actually happening is a direct assault on the entire structure, holding their self-concept together. Because if you were never actually the problem, if your strength proves you were capable all along of exactly the stability and clarity they claimed you lacked, then the only remaining explanation for what went wrong sits squarely with them. And that explanation is the one thing their entire psychological architecture is built to avoid facing directly. So what do they actually do once they encounter this kind of strength? It rarely happens all at once, and it almost never looks like the dramatic confrontation people imagine. It unfolds in a fairly predictable sequence, and understanding each stage in advance means you won't be caught off guard when it happens to you. The first response, almost universally, is testing. This isn't necessarily conscious or strategic in the way it might sound. It's often closer to instinct, the same instinct that's worked reliably on nearly everyone else in their life. They'll push against the boundary you've set, gently at first, watching for the familiar signs of it softening. A slightly guilt-laced comment about how cold you've become. A reference to how things used to be, delivered with just enough nostalgia to test whether it still produces the reaction it used to. A request framed as reasonable, "Can we just talk like adults?" designed to make your continued firmness look unreasonable rather than protective. This testing phase exists because, throughout their entire relational history, boundaries have almost always been soft, stated with conviction sometimes, but flexible under the right pressure, applied at the right angle for long enough. They're not necessarily expecting your strength to be different. They're checking. Here's what happens when the testing doesn't produce the expected result, when the boundary holds calmly, without escalating into an argument they know how to work with and without softening into the accommodation they're hoping for. This is where the second response typically emerges, and it's worth understanding clearly because it's often mistaken for something it isn't. the testing intensifies, not because your strength is failing to have an effect, quite the opposite. It's intensifying precisely because it's working, and a narcissist facing a boundary that refuses to move doesn't typically respond by simply accepting it. They respond by increasing pressure. The same way anyone whose primary tool has always worked eventually tries using more of it when the usual amount stops producing results. This escalation can take several forms, and it's worth naming them specifically so you recognize them when they arrive. Sometimes it looks like anger, sudden disproportionate frustration at a request or boundary that seems, on its face, completely reasonable. Sometimes it looks like an intensified performance of vulnerability, tears, or apparent distress calibrated specifically to reach the parts of you that used to soften fastest. Sometimes, and this is worth naming because it's one of the more disorienting versions, it looks like triangulation, bringing in mutual friends, family members, or a new partner to subtly pressure you into softening, framing your continued strength as unreasonable in front of an audience who might not have the full context you have. None of this is random. Each version of escalation is underneath the surface testing a different angle to see if any of them still produce the old result. And this is exactly the moment your strength either holds genuinely, structurally, without needing to prove anything to anyone watching, or quietly starts to erode under the specific, calibrated pressure being applied against it. If your strength does hold through the escalation phase, and this is the piece worth understanding in real detail, because it's where the entire dynamic shifts permanently, something significant starts happening inside the narcissist that goes well beyond simple frustration at not getting their way. Because up until this point, every version of pressure they've applied has been drawn from a toolkit that has always eventually worked before with someone. Watching that entire toolkit fail systematically, one tactic at a time, against a boundary that simply doesn't move, forces them into territory their psychology has almost no experience navigating, genuine uncertainty about whether they still have the power they've always assumed they had. This is where the third response typically emerges, and it's the one most people don't expect, because it looks almost nothing like the earlier stages. Rather than continuing to escalate indefinitely, many narcissists shift into what looks, from the outside, like sudden withdrawal or apparent indifference. This isn't genuine acceptance, and it's important to understand the difference clearly, because it's easy to mistake this stage for the narcissist finally gracefully backing off. What's actually happening is closer to a strategic retreat, an attempt to regain the upper hand by appearing unbothered, sometimes by moving quickly toward a new source of attention or validation, specifically calibrated to make you wonder whether your strength actually mattered to them at all, or whether you overestimated your own significance in walking away from someone who apparently doesn't need you back. This particular tactic deserves special attention because it's genuinely one of the most psychologically sophisticated of all the responses, even when it isn't consciously calculated as a strategy. It works by exploiting a very specific vulnerability that even strong, healed people can carry: the quiet hope that your strength was somehow witnessed and registered as significant by the person you built it in response to. Watching them appear to move on effortlessly, seemingly unbothered by the boundary that took you so much internal work to build, can feel like evidence that the strength didn't matter, that your growth went unnoticed, that all of this internal work was somehow performed for an audience that simply changed the channel. Here's what's important to understand about this apparent indifference, because it changes how much weight you should give it. It's almost always at least partially performed, even when some genuine emotional distancing is happening alongside the performance. A narcissist who has genuinely, completely stopped caring about your reaction doesn't typically need to display that indifference this visibly, this specifically, in ways clearly designed to be witnessed by you or by mutual connections who will relay it back to you. Genuine indifference is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. The loud, visible version of moving on effortlessly that seems specifically engineered to reach you is, more often than not, still a form of engagement, dressed up as its opposite. One more attempt, disguised as retreat, to provoke exactly the reaction that earlier, more direct attempts failed to produce. This is where your continued strength matters most, because the correct response to this apparent indifference isn't to chase it, isn't to wonder whether you need to prove your strength further by matching their apparent unbothered energy, and isn't to soften your boundary out of a fear that you've somehow overreacted to someone who clearly wasn't that invested to begin with. The correct response is simply to continue living exactly as you were before this stage began, genuinely uninterested in whether your strength is being witnessed or acknowledged at all, because your strength was never actually built for an audience in the first place. Here's what happens. Over a longer timeline, when your strength holds through all three of these stages, the testing, the escalation, and the apparent indifferent withdrawal, without ever bending back toward the old dynamic. This is where the real, permanent psychological shift occurs, and it's worth understanding in depth because it explains something that confuses a lot of people trying to make sense of narcissistic behavior from the outside. Why some narcissists eventually seem to genuinely, permanently stop pursuing certain people while continuing to pursue or return to others repeatedly, sometimes for years. The difference almost always comes down to exactly this: whether the strength being tested ever cracked, even once, even briefly, at any point during the process. A narcissist's psychology is remarkably good at remembering, on some level, which strategies eventually produced results even after significant delays. If your strength held through testing and escalation but softened even slightly during the apparent indifference phase, if you reached out during their performed withdrawal, if you tried to explain yourself, if you sought reassurance that your boundaries still mattered even after they seemed to stop caring, this becomes valuable information stored for future use. It confirms that this particular boundary, while resistant to direct pressure, is vulnerable to the specific tactic of apparent withdrawal, which means that tactic is likely to resurface again, later, precisely because it eventually worked. If your strength holds through all three stages without ever bending, something different and more permanent happens. The narcissist's internal cost-benefit calculation, running largely unconsciously throughout this entire process, finally reaches a conclusion their psychology has been actively avoiding: that this particular source of supply, this particular relationship, this particular version of you genuinely isn't reachable through any tool currently available to them. This conclusion doesn't usually produce growth or accountability. We've discussed in earlier videos why that outcome remains relatively rare. What it typically produces instead is redirection, a genuine, lasting shift of attention toward a new source of supply who hasn't yet built the same kind of resistance you have. This redirection, painful as it might sound if you're hoping for a different kind of ending, is actually the outcome that protects you most completely, because it means the testing genuinely stops. Not because they've grown, and not because they've suddenly developed respect for your boundaries as a matter of principle, but because their own psychology has concluded, based on real evidence gathered across this entire multi-stage process, that continued effort here simply isn't worth the investment anymore. This is where the story arrives at what matters most, because everything we've walked through so far, the testing, the escalation, the performed withdrawal, the eventual redirection, once your strength proves genuinely unshakable, describes what happens on their side of this dynamic. And I want to be honest with you about something important before we close this out. Understanding their side clearly is useful, even necessary, for recognizing the pattern and holding your ground through it. But it was never actually the point of building your strength in the first place, and treating their eventual redirection as the finish line risks missing what this entire process was actually about. Here's what I mean by that, and it's worth sitting with directly. If you build your strength primarily as a tool to outlast their testing, if the goal, even unconsciously, becomes proving that you can withstand more pressure than they can apply, winning some silent contest of endurance, you're still, in a real sense, organizing your life around their behavior. You're still measuring your own progress against their reactions, still waiting to see whether they'll eventually back off, still treating their redirection towards someone new as the confirmation that your strength actually worked. This framing, understandable as it is, keeps you tethered to their story even while you're technically winning it, because a contest, by definition, requires an opponent whose moves you're still tracking closely. The strength this entire series has actually been pointing toward is different from that, and it's worth naming the distinction clearly as we close this out. Genuine strength isn't built to withstand their testing. It's built because withstanding it happens to be a byproduct of something much more important, no longer needing anything from them at all, regardless of what they do in response. This distinction matters enormously because it changes what actually happens inside you during each of the stages we've described. If your strength is built to win a contest against their tactics, every stage of testing becomes a fresh battle, requiring renewed vigilance, renewed resolve, renewed proof that you can hold the line one more time. If your strength is built from genuinely no longer needing anything from them, each stage of testing simply becomes irrelevant information about their internal state, requiring nothing from you at all, because you were never actually invested in the outcome of their strategy to begin with. This is the version of strength that actually terrifies them most, and it's worth understanding why this version specifically, rather than the more effortful, contest-oriented version, produces the most permanent, most complete redirection away from you. A narcissist testing a boundary they suspect is still on some level being maintained through effort and willpower senses something different than a narcissist testing a boundary that's genuinely, structurally no longer connected to any need at all. The first kind of boundary, however impressively maintained, still contains a thread of investment for them to sense and potentially exploit. The effort itself is a kind of evidence that the relationship still matters enough to require active resistance. The second kind of boundary offers nothing to sense at all, because there's no effort happening underneath it to detect. It simply is what it is, indifferent to whether it's being tested or not, because the person holding it has genuinely moved past needing anything from the person doing the testing. If you're currently in the middle of building this, watching the testing arrive, feeling the pull toward escalation or the disorientation of their apparent indifference, wondering whether your strength is actually working or whether you're somehow getting this wrong, I want you to release the question of whether it's working from your mind entirely. Not because the answer doesn't matter, but because needing to know the answer keeps you exactly where this entire process is trying to move you away from, oriented around their reaction as the measure of your own progress. Your strength was never actually meant to be their nightmare as its primary purpose, even though understanding that it functions that way can be validating after everything you went through to build it. It was always meant to be your own foundation, solid enough to hold regardless of what tests arrive against it. Not because you're proving anything to anyone watching, but because you finally fully deserve to stand on something that doesn't depend on someone else's approval, someone else's absence, or someone else's eventual redirection toward a new source of supply in order to remain real. They may test it, they may escalate, retreat, redirect toward someone new who hasn't yet built what you've built. None of that determines whether your strength is genuine. What determines that is something entirely within your own reach, something that was never actually about them from the very beginning, no matter how much of this entire journey involved learning to withstand exactly what they threw at it. Your strength is their nightmare, yes, but that was only ever a side effect. The actual purpose was always simply you finally standing on ground solid enough that nothing they do and nothing they don't do gets to decide whether you're still standing there tomorrow. That ground was always yours to build. It still is. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please like, share, and subscribe for more videos. Take care. Have a nice time.